Welcome, everyone. I'm Kevin Zeller. I'm a partner at Husch Blackwell, and I'm in our real estate development group and construction group, as well as our banking and finance group. Joining me to moderate our panel today is a fellow Husch Blackwell attorney named Purvi Shah. Before I begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for use during the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit them via the question box. We will try to answer all questions during the webcast today, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. A PDF of the presentation is available in the resources folder. The program has been approved for law practice management legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Toward the end of the program, be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. That is all for the housekeeping items. Let's get started with our program. We are excited to be taking a forward look at the state of the real estate financing market from the lender, investor, and developer perspectives, as well as the impact and potential opportunities this presents to the Kansas City area community. And at that, now I'm going to turn it over to Purvi.
Thanks, Kevin. We are pleased to have John McGurk, Vice President of Development at Millhouse, Greg Duvall, Senior Vice President, Managing Director at Northmark, and Justin Estes, Senior Vice President, Commercial Credit Officer of PNC with us today. John is responsible for the development pipeline, entitlement, design, and ongoing development of projects for Millhouse in the Kansas City region. Prior to joining Millhouse, John worked for Kansas City's Mayor Sly James as Chief of Staff and for Pulcinelli as a shareholder in the real estate development practice most recently. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in history, political science, and environmental studies, and received his law degree from the University of Missouri-Kansas City. John has been recognized as an up-and-coming lawyer and a rising lawyer in Missouri. He is also heavily involved in ULI and chairs the District Council's DAP committee. Greg's primary focus is supporting clients with their real estate capital needs. He currently oversees the Kansas City office as Senior Vice President, Managing Director, and has consistently been a top producer at Northmark since coming aboard in 1987. Prior to joining the company, he was employed in the real estate investment department at Travelers. He obtained his BS degree in business from the University of Kansas and his Master's of Business Administration from the University of Memphis. Greg holds a Missouri and Kansas broker's license and is a member of the MBA. Justin is a Senior Vice President of PNC Bank, covering credit officer responsibilities for commercial real estate groups, primarily the Permanent Lending Program, or PLP, and Mortgage Warehouse, in addition to shadowing the credit team with historic and new market tax credit opportunities. Prior to his role within credit risk management, Justin held various roles with PNC Real Estate as a relationship manager based in Dallas, covering real estate developers in the state of Texas, a senior underwriter in the Permanent Lending Program, a workout officer in the asset resolution team, an underwriter in CMBS held for sale, and an analyst at Midland Loan Services, primarily covering BlackRock subordinate debt portfolios. Justin holds a bachelor's degree in finance from Kansas State University and an MBA from Rockhurst University. I will now turn it over to John to start our presentation.
Sorry, I was muted. John McGurk with Millhouse. Thanks, Purvi and Kevin and the entire Husch Blackwell team for putting this together. Excited to be with you today. As Purvi indicated, I'm Vice President of Development for Millhouse. We are a primarily urban core redeveloper of mixed-use multifamily product. We're based out of Indianapolis, but I run what we call the Midwest West market, which includes Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, Colorado, and kind of responsible for all of the development pipeline from project conception through construction and lease up. Wanted to just chat a little bit today on kind of the state of the lending market, where we see things. The short of it is we are really seeing a limited bank activity in the market across all of our markets. To give a little bit of context, historically, we will receive 3 to 5 term sheets from 6 to 8 banks underwriting a project. We are now getting 1 to 2 term sheets from 20 banks underwriting a project. So we've seen significant decrease in activity from banks. A lot of what we're seeing that as a result of is bank portfolio's performance is really impacting that activity. Banks really are looking to expand their existing relationships and really aren't looking at new relationships. And that kind of a lot of our lending partners are really limiting their footprint to kind of their areas and not kind of traveling with clients like they used to. Large regional banks have, for the most part, kind of taken a sideline approach with minimal to no lending. Kind of the reasons around that, and we'll let Justin kind of talk a little bit more about this, but we're seeing that they've had an overload of PPP applications and processing and things that go along with that. They're really focused on their portfolio and managing that. And a lot of folks have had a lot of hits on their portfolio in the office and retail sectors. So they're really focused on working through issues of their portfolio and not expanding. Where we have seen success in new and existing lending relationships have been small and local banks. They still really seem to be active and are looking to kind of expand their local relationships. And so every market we're in, we are attempting to expand kind of our relationships with local and small banks to at least 5 to 10 per market. So that has been where we have found success in kind of these uncertain times with COVID, is really on the small local banks that know the markets well, that understand how multifamily and other asset classes are performing in their markets. Kind of some of the other issues that we're seeing, structural impacts, the implementation of LIBOR floors. Typically, we would never see floors in our interest rates, but banks are starting to put a lot of floors there. Spreads have widened as well. And we're starting to see a lot more unconditional guarantees with limited or no burn-offs, where historically we'd seen mini perms offered that would offer some relief from those guarantees. But we are seeing less and less of that, a lot more floors, and those spreads, like I indicated, getting a little bit wider than we typically have. But in short, we're seeing projects get done. It's just taking a lot more work, a lot more relationship building than it has in the past, which hopefully in the future will pay dividends, but it is a little sparse right now. So with that kind of concludes kind of what I wanted to talk about. I'll throw it over to Greg with Northmark, and he can take it from there. Greg?
Thank you, John. I'm Greg Duvall from Northmark Capital. We're not a household name, so I'll give you a little background on the company. We're Minneapolis-based, privately owned business. Its roots go back to the 40s and 50s. The Hams beer family, Hams family out of Minneapolis, which was in the beer business, owned us, started us. This was a part of their real estate was a part of their brewery business, actually. But company grew, and in the late 90s, the Hams family sold it to our current owners, the Polads. Polads are a billionaire family in Minneapolis, best known for their ownership of the Minneapolis Twins. So Northmark is a national firm. We have probably 35 to 40 offices across the country. In terms of producers, probably 175 producers kind of do the same thing I do throughout the country. So we have a national scope. We're an intermediary really between the capital markets for commercial real estate. We provide debt and equity both. Kansas City office has traditionally been primarily a debt provider. We're an intermediary between life companies and borrowers, agencies, Freddie, Fannie, borrowers. We're a HUD lender, and we broker a few loans to banks, but that'd be a relatively minor segment of what we do. Before I kind of give my 2 cents on where I think we're going here in the near future, let me give you my spin on where I think Kansas City was really going into the pandemic. From my perspective, the Kansas City economy was, if not on fire, it was on fire by Kansas City standards. We're pretty slow and steady, as most people know, but it's been a very healthy economy, a lot of diversity between technology, government, finance, and other segments. We have a very diversified economy, which has served us pretty well in the past. There's been seems like a relatively strong amount of population growth into the region. And as the pandemic hit, I think that is we've all read, and we all probably know somebody that's moved out of a big city and moved back to Kansas City and is kind of threatening to stay here. So I think we are benefiting from migration to Kansas City, partly from the pandemic, but we also obviously benefit from the lower cost of living. And Kansas City is a good place to live right now. I think it's been a great place. The downtown's in better shape than it's ever been since I've been an adult. I remember as a young guy, you go downtown to Kansas City, you had about 3 restaurants, 3 or 4. You have the Italian Gardens, I believe was the name of the Italian place down there, and Hereford House, Golden Ox, and if you're lucky to belong to River Club, you could go there. But there weren't a lot of options. Now there's a ton of options. It's a great place for young people to live, and I think Kansas City's been in a really good spot here leading up to the pandemic. So the pandemic hits, and in terms of the commercial real estate markets and the lending markets, from my perspective, again, I do permanent debts. I'm not heavily involved in construction financing and development financing, but I mostly do perm debt. There was initially a lot of uncertainty, and there was a big disruption to the equilibrium that we had been relatively enjoying. A big chunk of what we do in the perm market is refinance. Most loans are 10-year terms. Not all, but that's the kind of the gold standard is a 10-year loan. And typically we do maybe 65% of refinances and 35% somewhere around there for acquisition financing. Well, the acquisition financing just came to a halt. It had been relatively active. March, April, nobody knew what properties were worth. There's concern about tenants of all types moving out, vacating their properties, which a lot of them have done. And so as a result, the lenders we deal with, the life company lenders really hit the brakes pretty hard, at least initially. They either pulled out of the market or they reduced their loan to values dramatically, increased debt coverage ratio, just generally came up with much more conservative terms. As John mentioned, a lot of them implemented floors in their rates, and it was a pretty significant pullback. The agencies, which is the lender that I deal with and the Kansas City office deals with most frequently, they did as they're supposed to do. They did a good job of maintaining liquidity in the markets. They never pulled out of the market. They did pull in a little bit, became a little bit more conservative, implemented some debt service reserves that were really COVID focused. And those were to protect, their loans in the event. I should back up a step. There was the moratorium on evictions, and so the landlords are in a position where they can't evict their tenants if they get furloughed and lose their jobs. So anyway, there was the agencies implemented some debt service reserves to provide some protection in the event of the property gets in trouble, I should say, somewhere down the road. So it was pretty significant. Overall in the industry, but generally things have continued to progress. If you've got a property that is if you're a good sponsor and you have good stability in your property, we can certainly still find attractive financing. It'll be a little more conservatively underwritten than it would have been, back in this time last year. But there's certainly some benefits to what we're going through right now. Shannon, I think I'd like to, if you could pull up that first slide. I've got a slide here that shows where the 10-year treasuries have been historically, and I know everybody's aware of this, but I have to look at it every once in a while just to remind myself how remarkable what the change in treasuries, what it's done. Well, I got in the business kind of back at the peak. I went to Travelers in the early to mid 80s, and gosh, it was up in the 15% range, somewhere in that range for 10-year treasuries. Now we're I think 75, 80 bips as of today. The next slide shows that really the trailing 12 treasuries. If you could pull that up, Shannon, I think it's there. The thing to focus on here is what happened February, March. You can see where it kind of fell off a cliff. We were somewhere in the 150, 160 for the 10-year treasury. It dropped down to about 50 bips. I think there were some intraday trades below 0.5%. It has settled out, and the Federal Reserve seems to be focused on maintaining a treasury yield on the 10-year somewhere in the 65 to call it 80 bip range. I don't know where it is today, but it's been in that kind of tight in that range for the last 4 or 5 months. So they're continuing. The Fed is focused on keeping rates low. We've all heard that. I don't think that's going to change here in the near term, and that is certainly helping prop up the credit markets and the cap rates. There's no place else to put your money. So generally speaking, the multifamily sector has performed pretty well. We'll see if there's an end of the PPP product, if the tenants are going to be fall on a greater financial hardship, that could change. But so far, there's been no big hiccups in the multifamily sector, which is where I spend most of my time. Retail, I think everybody knows what's going on there. It's really been tough for them. It was a tough market to begin with, and I think it's going to continue to be a tough market going forward. There's a lot of conversion. There will be a lot of conversion of the classic retail space to other uses. I've seen it. I saw it in Chicago a few months ago. Went up and visited my son and daughter-in-law, and we took their daughter to go swimming at a swimming pool that was in a traditional shopping center. And I think I just saw that recently in Kansas City. So anyway, retail owners are going to have to figure out other uses for a lot of this space. Restaurants are, certainly struggling right now, and a lot of them are out of business or will go out of business. So it'll be a tough segment. The office segment, again, a lot of us are probably tuned in from home locations for this webinar. It was not the strongest segment, the commercial real estate before the pandemic hit, and it's been hit hard too. It will pass. The pandemic's going to pass, and I'm not predicting that everybody's going to work at home forever. There will be a percentage of people that will kind of their way of life's going to be changed going forward. But I think most people are going to settle back at the office over time. But it certainly has kind of been a kick in the groin to the office industry. So industrial, I don't do a lot of it, but it's been very healthy. Kansas City throughout this thing, I think Kansas City's industrial market's going to continue to flourish. So that's kind of, I think the multifamily and industrial are going to do well. I think office and retail are going to struggle. I think rates are going to stay relatively low because of the fact that the Fed and Congress are going to do everything they can to kind of keep rates where they can, to keep the economy alive, or to bring it back to life, I should say, over the next year or so. So that kind of wraps up my comments. Justin, why don't you take over?
All right, thank you. Where I'm going to start is basically just going to dovetail from John and Greg. I'm agreeing with what I'm seeing on the lending side is kind of where they're, what they're saying here. I'll start off, and I'll be brief on this first slide. Everybody knows where we're at right now. Commercial real estate industry has significant challenges. And really from the lending standpoint, it's trying to get a hold of performance, looking forward, and then, what future value is going to look like. And really that's tough to really get your hands around until we can get to a more normalized state. And the headwinds are going to take several years to probably get all the way through for sectors like lodging and some retail. But then there's been some real winners in the real estate space too. And so I'll get into that. But the challenges are, it's going to be your service-based retail, it's lodging, it's depending on what city you're in. To what Greg mentioned is, if you're urban and you're retail, you're going to struggle there too. So moving into the next slide, I'll just, where do we go the next 12 or 24 months? John mentioned this, no surprise. Lenders have basically pivoted, and there's a paradigm shift back to the defensive position. Anybody that was at the MBA in February in San Diego, all I heard in those meetings were we were going to have a record year, whether it was the agencies, whether it was banking, whether development, acquisitions. Everything I heard in February was this: we have clear sailing heading into the elections, which are in a few weeks from now. And, we went home thinking, okay, it's going to be a smooth sailing. 30 days later, I call it the Tom Hanks phenomenon, but when Tom Hanks got COVID and the NBA shut down on the same day, I think we all kind of realized, oh no, we've got an issue here. And so we saw a big paradigm shift. Everybody went into that, highly defensive position. I sit on the credit side, and all of a sudden we went into portfolio management from being aggressive lenders. And, so that, all that momentum then, kind of rolls back into the lenders. And so first things first, the lodging sector got slammed. If you were a business hotel, a convention hotel, all of a sudden you're looking at your forecast and you're seeing hundreds of rooms come offline. Those were really the first deals that we saw really struggle. And with that, it was, loan modifications start coming up. Hey, what can you do for us in terms of deferrals? I'm not going to hit this covenant this quarter. Can we waive this? We started talking about, okay, interest only deferrals. Are we going to have to start restructuring some of these loans? And that was more with the term debt than it was with construction. If you're construction and you're out of the ground and still being built, those conversations were really just more around funding delays, and you were getting kind of backed up on your construction. But so this first wave was really the lodging sector, and then as service industry started to shut down, restaurants shut down, gyms shut down, our retail owners started coming to us saying, "Hey, my collections are 15% this month. I'm not getting paid. I've got especially if it's a non-recourse loan, I've got deposits, but we're going to run through those in about 2 or 3 months." And so those first 60 days, really trying to just get a handle. Everyone at the banks are just trying to get a handle on what their portfolio is. And then, to the points of John and Greg's selective lending practices, we weren't thinking, how many great deals there are in the market right now. And I think a lot of really good deals that are out there kind of slid down the scale to, instead of your regional banks and your, money center banks. I think there's a lot of good opportunities out there, especially that were shovel ready and out of the ground, and from the refi standpoint, where, you throw a little strong recourse on it and you're able to get a pretty good deal from some of the smaller banks that probably couldn't compete, 6 months to 12 months ago. And then really the government programs and the PPP, that really saved a lot of, it was the stopgap from a lot of the, service industry types, and giving them, the hotels, and giving them at least a 6-month runway to stay in the game. And so I think it's globally, everybody thinks we need more stimulus to come in. We're going to see more pain, but that's really kind of what happened from the lending. Again, uncertainties with fundamentals. How long is this going to last? How do you value it? How do you structure it? Those are questions that we're going to have to solve really, in the future. But at the end of the day, and John mentioned this, and I'm sure Greg would too, relationship matters. And it might not have mattered as much 12 months ago, but it matters in times like these. If you've had a strong history with somebody and you've got, deep relationships, it's a lot more difficult for them to turn you away than if you're just a one-off transaction. And I won't get too deep into that, but there's going to be a difference with how you're treated with your number one bank where you hold your deposits, where you've got your wealth management, than if you're dealing with a servicer, with one of the CMBS shops. And that's true, and everybody knows the relationship game. But these are the moments in the cycle where you really do fall on your relationships, and you do kind of, make it more of a partnership. Rethinking and what we are learning, again, with the paradigm shift, and John and Greg kind of touched on this, so I will be brief with these as well. The office sector, we've learned a lot in the last 6 months with working from anywhere. You don't have to be tied to your desk anymore at the office. And I think probably the younger generation figured this out, 5 to 10 years ago when they were working from home, through VPN at midnight, and you were getting all these young guys that were working nights and stuff in your inbox for the morning. But I've learned a lot from working from anywhere. I've been at my home office for 7 months. I've mastered the digital signature and the DocuSign. I'm basically paperless right now. And if I would have, thought back to, again, February,
I think we may have lost Justin for a moment, so if everybody could hold tight, we appreciate it. While we wait for Justin to get back on and continue through with his presentation, I'm going to throw a question over to John McGurk. John, in the near term to the middle term to the medium term, with the lack of access or decrease in access to funding, to financing, is that going to impact, or do you think it will impact Millhouse's pipeline, again, in the short to medium term, or have you all discussed alternatives with just funding them initially with equity and then maybe refinancing on the back end? Or how do you guys think you're going to handle the short and medium term as far as your pipeline?
Yeah. So we have not had as big of an impact as probably some other groups have had. We may have to adjust our capital stack. We typically underwrite pretty conservatively. So, our general rule of thumb is, we'll have a 65% levered project, 35% equity. Will we have to move that, up to or down to 60% levered maybe, and we could do that just funding more equity. It changes the return profile of the overall project clearly, because you're using a lot more expensive capital, but getting through the construction, it may not kill a deal totally. But typically we're kind of down the middle of the fairway, so to speak, in terms of our leverage. So we have not seen a huge pushback. Like I mentioned in my comments earlier, it's really where we would get 4 or 5 term sheets going out to 5 or 6 banks. We're just having to talk to a lot more people to get the debt lined up. And like Justin said, and I mentioned earlier, relationships have been key. So warm introductions to local banks, have been a big factor for us recently in getting deals over the finish line. But, to directly answer your question, we haven't had to totally rethink our strategy. We've just had to make tweaks here and honestly just work a lot harder than we've had to in the past to find those relationships and those lending partners.
I made it back, and it's a little embarrassing that I was touting how I've mastered working from home, and I lost my connection. So
happens to the best of us.
Glad to have you. Carry on.
Okay, so my apologies for that. Like I said, still more to come. But with the office sector, really, it's the future demand requirements, and from a lending perspective, if you've got an anchor tenant and that takes 5 stories of your 10-story building that has a lease that's coming up in the next year or two, really just keeping your fingers crossed that they need all the space and that they'll renew it, and you're not trying to backfill major tenants in the office sector. But office has been kind of turned on its head. Pivoting into retail, the question of who survives, it's winners and losers. If you're a grocery anchored center, I think you're doing pretty good. I think if you've mastered the delivery and the e-commerce, so think Kansas City Joe's has done really well at this. Chipotle's done well. Starbucks have done well. If you've mastered your online presence and your delivery and your pickup, and you've got strong anchor with a grocery store, I think you're maybe surviving this. If you're across the street at Town Center and you've got the Macy's there and you've got a bookstore and you've got some big holes in your center, you're probably keeping your fingers crossed. And you kind of compound that with the services and some of the smaller mom and pops, and you've got a lot to digest. And some of the stats that I've had, we've had 46 public retailers that have gone BK and over 10,000 store closings. So retail is really getting punished, and still think it may be in the early innings there. But really, some retail has succeeded if they've mastered the technology, and some that haven't, I think, are going to continue to struggle. To Greg's point on housing, low interest rates has really helped out the housing market, especially on refis. The agencies, that we're seeing are all having record to near record years. The major cities are having a migration problem. I don't necessarily see it here in the Midwest, but I think there is some suburban flight in, the New York areas, the Boston areas, probably, on the West Coast, and maybe some of those core areas you're starting to see people migrate out. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that you can office from anywhere. Does this put pressure on multifamily long-term? Collections still seem to be fairly strong with multifamily. I don't see, and we've got plaza exposure. I don't see, the plaza is always going to be there. I think what they're doing City Market is good, and down around Sprint Center is good. So, I do think that the urban areas in Kansas City probably do okay. Again, if you're in Manhattan, New York, though, that might not be the same case. Lodging is getting absolutely slammed. There's staffing reductions, expense reductions. If you're tied to business travel or conventions, you're just seeing a lot of multi-year pain. The limited service and some of the roadside stuff, some of the tertiary markets are doing better. I'll just use an example. If you're in Savannah, Georgia, you're starting to see a lot of travel from Atlanta, where, summer vacations, we're, instead of driving, or instead of flying somewhere, maybe we drive 2 or 3 hours to a location. And so some of those more touristy areas are doing better, especially with, limited service stays. You're not seeing nearly the hit, but lodging just in general has been pretty much a bloodbath. And then finally, the warehouse data center space is doing gangbusters. As we do the online direct to consumer, we're seeing, record absorption in Dallas, Fort Worth, 21 million square feet so far this year. Cold storage with grocery delivery is one of those new kind of niche markets that are They're doing okay. So really, takeaway from this is just market research and intelligence is really where we need to focus. Real-time information to be able to make decisions. Just a couple data points that I wrote down here that I glossed over. Of retail space in Times Square, they've got 30% vacancies right now, and rents on Madison Avenue are down 20%. So as you get into those more core areas, those more dense areas, and with everybody kind of dispersing and the tourists kind of being down and nobody working in these areas, they're really seeing a lot of pain. So final slide, really just the current and the future as part of the rebuild. The analogy that we use is the three-legged stool, and this kind of goes to John's point of how do you get deals done. With a current deal, there's only really a few things you can touch from the lending standpoint. You can touch the structure, you can kind of tinker with the leverage and the guarantees, or you can adjust pricing. And really, if it's portfolio management, it's a current loan you have. Really, you're going to trade off, short-term relief for some longer-term structure. And that's really, the banks are going to want to look at cash management. They're going to want to increase guarantee. If there's performance declines at the property, we have to hold reserves that make our loans more expensive. So you're probably going to see pricing adjustments. The competition really isn't there for, if you're coming up on a refinance, if you've got outs, like if you can do agency refi, on a 10-year deal that Greg was talking about, I think you're still good. I mean, there's a lot of competition that's still out there. I think, like I said, both Fannie and Freddie are going to have record years this year. But the other product types, some of the stuff that, the retail stuff, the office, if you've got a current deal and you need to work with your lenders, you're really going to have to touch one of those 3 points. And really, from our standpoint, we're just trying to be consistent between what we're doing for one group versus another. And, if it's a 3-month deferral, we're going to try to do that consistently across the portfolio based on need. Because at the end of the day, what we're doing as a bank, we have to answer to the regulators. And they're going to open up our portfolio and our books and say, okay, why did you do this for Greg and not John? And if we're not consistent, we're going to have a rationale on why we're doing it. With new lending, I think if you're in lodging or retail, it's really you're bound by the return to normal. It's really going to be difficult to get those projects refinanced if you're over levered. And I think if the lower leverage you have there, the better structure you have, I mean, you're going to there's going to be some right sizing that's going to be needed for those. If it's new acquisition, I think you're probably if you're a long-term owner, you're probably going to find some deals here in the markets coming into 2021, 2022. Office, we're going to have to figure out this work from anywhere and the impacts on demand and what that initially looks like. Warehouse, if you're tied into that last mile e-commerce, I think you're going to do fairly well. I think multifamily still does fairly well. But at the end of the day, it's just communication between the tenants, between the landlords, lenders, and regulators. And it's all just a matter of, all of us are at this point are kind of in this together, and our success is kind of dependent on that. So those are really my high level comments, and Kevin, so I can turn it back over to the moderators.
Great, thanks. And this is just a reminder, we're moving into the question and answer portion of our presentation. So if anybody in the audience wants to submit a question, please do so by submitting through the question and answer box. My next question is for Greg. Greg, you kind of hinted at, and Justin has hinted at it as well, that in order to get deals done, we've seen changes in structure, pricing, et cetera, guarantees. But Greg, could you maybe be a little more specific as far as are there any consistent themes you're seeing that borrowers are being asked to do by either the agencies or your primary, your primary lending partners? that you're seeing very regularly in the last few months, and that you think you're going to see in the next few following months?
I'd say the biggest thing is real equity is means more now than it has for quite some time. Cash out refinances they're doable, but they aren't automatic. In the last 3 years ago, somebody could buy a property. They could have bought a property in 2015, come to us in 2017, and reasonably expected to get an 80%. This is on an apartment deal, 80% loan to value refinance. That's difficult to do today unless you've got 80%. You're not going to borrow. You're not going to pull cash out often unless there's extenuating circumstances. Maybe if you paid all cash for something, or you have really low leverage and you're trying to leverage it up to a still relatively conservative amount, say 65, 70, 75% tops. That can be done with good sponsorship, good history, stable property, et cetera. But the days of using the supplemental loan or refinance as a piggy bank, I'm not saying they're gone forever. They're gone for right now. It's not nearly as easy to do. I think Justin mentioned something kind of on the same topic, a little off topic, but the relationships are more important now than they have been for quite some time. Back in March, when the agencies, probably April, when they offered forbearance for borrowers, it was interesting to see borrowers in some cases who had been 2 months earlier talking to us about a new financing opportunity, and they were touting their strong balance sheet, how they don't need to borrow our money, or they're going to borrow on their terms, not our terms. But then once the difficulties hit, several of them would be the first ones to put their hands up to take forbearance when it was offered by the agencies. And I wouldn't call that a black eye for that particular borrower or those particular borrowers, but the ones who didn't stick their arms up and didn't take forbearance just because it was offered, I think that meant a lot to the lenders, the people who are in it for the long term and are going to stand by their properties no matter what. I think that spoke volumes for their character in a positive way.
Yeah, I'll just add to that if we've got a state, let's say it's 100 borrowers, we see it. I mean, we see who's asking for help and who really needs it and who doesn't. So, we see a lot of requests for things, and it is a deal by deal, case by case basis. But we've had to reject some because an asset might still be cash flowing, and someone's asking for all of this deferral or remodification to a loan, and it's like, well, Jimmy, do you really need that? And then we have some where the deal really needs some assistance and some help, and in that case, yeah, maybe you grant some flexibility. But the relationship point more so. I'd say the last time we've seen this was the last financial crisis, where everybody was kind of in the same boat together. This was the last time the lenders have had, I guess, the pendulum has swung back to from a lending market to a banking market. The bankers were trying to maintain the portfolios as much as we can.
Okay, so we have an audience question, which I will ask to all the panelists. The question is, what would happen if the return to normal doesn't happen? What if it takes 4 to 5 years? How will that change things? John, do you want to start out?
Sure. I think it's something none of us want to think about, that happening. In the multifamily world, I think some people have hit on this. We've haven't had the issues other people have had. Our collections have held up very well. Our delinquencies went up a little bit, but we're talking from 0.5% to 1%. So, at the grand scheme of things, not impacted that much. We'll see if we can get a new stimulus deal done in the next few days. I think that's going to play a lot. I think, we have tenants that probably paid rent with some of those stimulus checks, and that's all running out. So we'll see. If we don't get back to a normal in 4 to 5 years, I think, we'll all have a lot of issues we're going to have to encounter. I just think we all hope and I think expect that not to happen. But I don't know if anybody else has got anything to chime in on that. That's a pretty daunting scenario to look at. And honestly, I don't know if there is a good answer if we are not back to quote unquote normal in a year or more. So
this isn't a, from a lending perspective, I'm an optimist. I know it's hard to believe from a lending, especially a credit person on the lending side, but I'm never surprised by the resiliency and creativeness of real estate owners and developers in regards to, repositioning properties. If it's, I've seen some really creative and cool repositionings to mixed use and to some other things. And so if there's a will, there's a way. If this rolls on several years, we probably do see commercial real estate a lot different. The traditional, big box anchored retail centers probably go away, and it probably looks like something different. So if it's a smaller retail footprint and more mixed use or something like that, whatever happens, I have confidence that the developers will make the best of it, and we'll see some pretty neat projects come out of it.
Greg, do you have any comments?
I don't have. I mean, I can't imagine either. God forbid it goes on that long. If it does, I think if the presidential election goes like the media is predicting and Biden is elected, I think if it goes on 3 or 4 years, I think he'll be a one-term, or Kamala will be a one-term president, because there'll be problems, and I think the commercial real estate problems will just be we'll be along with everybody else. The whole economy will be in a train wreck. I don't see it going on that long, but although, as Justin said, I guess we are pretty adaptive. The free market economy works pretty well, and I suppose masks would be the norm for everybody all the time, and we'll figure things out. But God forbid that happens.
Justin, you hinted at this a little bit of detail in your presentation, but are there any segments that you've been surprised as far as the resiliency of those segments in the real estate market? And then are there any, conversely, are there any segments that have sort of surprised you as far as being impacted by the COVID crisis?
Yeah. Grocery anchored retail, and I think it's broader than grocery. So I'll throw in like a Best Buy or, Target, Walmart, some of these anchors where it's consumer good, it's grocery, it's tech, sales. And if you look, and if you watch the equity markets, just what the stock prices have done with all these companies, like they've just blown through the roof. And I think, again, the creativeness of some of these major retailers to adapt so quickly is pretty surprising to me. We have several times a week, I'm driving to Target and I'm basically sitting in the parking lot, listening to music, looking at social media, and all my groceries and all my stuff is put in my car for me, and I drive home. And my wife does all the shopping for me, but it's like that is that was something that these major retailers figured out quickly. And I think not only do they need the stores and they need all that space, but again, their sales are actually improving. And, it's not the same, but they've adapted and they've been able to maintain, the sales at their stores. And that goes like with with some of the restaurants have figured that out too. And I think I think that's been what surprised me is, okay, how do I survive? And those that were creative and those that were up on tech managed to do it. And again, if you're a strictly services industry, that's not going to be feasible, but I was surprised by that. And then housing has actually been a surprise to me. I know a lot of this is Fed stimulus and a lot of it's, keeping the rates as low as they are. But the housing market, this is a surprise to me. I mean, if you're trying to get into a house, especially a starter house right now, Prairie Village or, Overland Park, you can't find a house. And if you do find one, you better put, an offer on it. So the suburban flight, Greg mentioned it, people coming back to Kansas City. I came back from Dallas, way before this happened. But I think, in my neighborhood, I am seeing a lot of out of state. I've got a Wisconsin and a California license plate of new people that have moved into my neighborhood. So we are seeing a little bit of that. So that's been a surprise too, is collections on multifamily and then just how resilient the single family has been in the area.
If I could add on to that last point, been a lot of apartments built. I've been doing a lot of apartments for a long time and go to dinner on a Friday night with another couple, and the guys always ask, what is going on with apartments in Kansas City? They're just every corner's got one. It does seem like there's a lot of apartments, but the reality is there still is a housing shortage, not just in Kansas City, but in the country. So somewhere between the single family and the multifamily, there's still a lot of people that there's not much affordable housing. And if you look at apartments, somebody's going to rent an apartment in Kansas City. I don't know what the number is today, and that $1,000 a month or something like that is a fairly decent apartment, not a class A first class, but it's a clean, safe apartment. And compare that to number one, to other cities, it's pretty damn reasonable. And if you compare it to the cost of a mortgage for what's the average house in the U.S., I think is $350,000, something like that today. And put a mortgage on there and maintenance costs, it's still pretty reasonably priced. So the point is, I don't think we are in a bubble at all in multifamily or in single family. There really is a need for more housing. Another comment or point I want to make earlier, I just forgot it, was part of this migration to Kansas City, which I think is real. It's not just Kansas City, but the migration out of the cities. It's partly the mass transit. I'm glad we've got a streetcar line going down Main Street. It's not something that many people really rely on to get to and from work, at least at this point. Perhaps someday it will be. But if you live in Chicago, if you live in Lincoln Park and you work downtown, you really pretty much need to get on a train every day. If you're in Manhattan or you live in the Queens or whatever, and you need to get into Manhattan, you got to get on mass transit or you got to deal with the traffic problem and where are you going to park your car? We don't have that. And I think that's something that is really helping us right now. And I think it'll continue to help us into the foreseeable future, the next 12 to 24 months at least, while this pandemic, while we're all still kind of responding to it. So Kansas City's big enough that we've got the sports teams, we got the arts. It's a great livable city, but we're not tied to some of the big city infrastructure. You don't have to take a train downtown, then get on an elevator and go up 50 floors with 16 other people every day. So that is playing our favor, I think, in the next 12 to 24 months.
John, to follow up on that, without revealing your, Millhouse's secret sauce, has the sort of major urban center flight that we've heard about and we talked about from the Chicagos, the Dallases, the New Yorks, the Bostons, have you heard any, or had any discussions internally about markets, mid-sized markets that you may be targeting that maybe you weren't before because of that, large city flight from the large cities?
I think it reinforces our business plan and strategy to look at kind of second tier Midwestern cities, because we are seeing an influx. It's not huge, but it's meaningful of people coming into, the Indianapolis, Kansas Cities, Oklahoma cities, Columbus, Ohio, Cincinnati. You're seeing a lot into the Florida market. So you are seeing that, and a lot of people from, the Bostons, the Californias, these typically high rent areas, because, I think everybody kind of commented on it, cost of living and just this forcing of a virtual world, which was probably coming, but it's been expedited by 5 to 10 years probably in a matter of months, has made a lot of people, we all grew up in Kansas City. We all know hundreds of people probably that have left that are now with young families thinking, well, I can keep my great job and move back to Kansas City. I know a lot of people I've grown up with in Kansas City have moved back or are contemplating moving back. So I think it's reinforced our business strategy of focusing on these second tier cities. So to Greg's point earlier on just, the urban cores, we're not seeing the outflux to suburbia like maybe some other areas are seeing. Traffic with COVID is certainly down, but renewals are up. So people are just kind of sitting tight is my take of the market. So I think Kansas City and other kind of second tier cities are well positioned as we kind of come out of COVID. I think we've held our own, and I think there'll be a lot of upside for our markets moving forward.
Okay, so I have time for one final question, which I want to ask Justin and Greg. What advice do you have for potential borrowers trying to get projects approved in 2021?
Greg, do you want me to start?
Tell us what we need to do.
I think, first of all, it's got to be a sound project. I think if it's a commercial deal, it's got to have pre-leasing in a lot of it. If it's a build-to-suit industrial deal, it's going to get done from somebody. But if it's a ground-up deal, you got to have the pre-leasing. If it's an existing deal, it's got to have the rollover on the rents have to look acceptable. Multifamily, I think you eventually get it done. But it's got, and Greg mentioned this, it's the leverage points. And, it's one thing to have mistakes on your book that you've made in the years prior. You don't want to be the guy that's putting new problems on your book during this crisis. So, banks are just naturally going to be more conservative because we don't want to add on to what we're already having to deal with the existing portfolio. So really, it's just a matter of making sure that if the deal does have an issue, that you've thought it through and you've got it and really coming to the solution. I like hearing, okay, if my borrower comes to me and, hey, we need a refi on this deal. We've got an anchor tenant that's rolling in year 3. Let's put a specific reserve on let's put some structure around that specific tenant. So if they do blow out, bank has, they've got something that they can, use to replenish, and that sort of thing. So really it's just a matter of, good deals, but if there is something that has an issue or needs to be addressed, proper leverage and proper structure and just coming to the lending market ready to present that sort of structure. So that's probably without, a deal specific kind of a broad answer.
I would, again, I don't do much development, construction lending, but on the perm side, really kind of the same thing. Equity is really important today, commitment to a property. It's what that demonstrates. And so, you know, just be realistic with your leverage expectations. Again, we can still do 75, 80% leverage on acquisition on a stable asset that has a, you know, a sustainable DCR that 125, 130 or better, you know, with a capable sponsor, it's still possible. But this is not the time where lenders are pushing the envelope for sure. So be realistic with your equity expectations, maybe, and that ultimately I think that's a decision on what kind of yield requirements you have. If you have to have a little bit more equity, doesn't mean it's a bad property, but your yield may be a little bit lower. So, you know, when you're looking at the alternative investments, when the treasuries are at 10-year treasuries yielding 80 basis points, maybe a little lower yield on your real estate investment over a 10-year or 7-year horizon, whatever. Maybe if you reduce your expectations by 50 basis points, maybe it's not that bad anyway. But that's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Greg. I'd like to just close out the webinar. Thank you for joining us today. We hope the information was helpful to you and your organization. As a reminder, please join us for our next program on November 19th, Public-Private Partnerships and the Academic Medical Campus in a New Economy. This program has been approved for law practice management, legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. And I know we had a question come through the Q&A box that we did not get a chance to answer, and we will answer that separately and send the response via email. This concludes our webinar. Thank you.